For over a century, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society has built its entire identity on one unwavering claim. They are God's sole channel of communication on earth, and unlike the false religions of Christendom, they never change their fundamental teachings or standards. This supposed immutability was presented as divine proof of their authenticity. As the Proclaimer's book proudly declared, Jehovah's Witnesses maintain unity of belief across all nations, a harmony that supposedly demonstrates God's blessing upon the organization. But something extraordinary happened between late 2023 and early 2026. In a span of less than 30 months, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses dismantled policy after policy, doctrine after doctrine, reversing positions they had held for decades and, in some cases, for over a century. Beards suddenly became acceptable after being grounds for loss of privileges since the 1960s. Women could now wear pants to kingdom halls and in field service. The mandatory tie and jacket disappeared from the platform. The detailed monthly field service reports that had defined witness identity for generations were simplified beyond recognition. Most shockingly, the harsh shunning policy that had torn families apart for decades was softened, allowing limited contact with disfellowshipped relatives. To an outsider, these might seem like reasonable modernizations. But to anyone familiar with the psychology of high-control religious groups, these changes tell a far more disturbing story. This is not the story of an organization becoming more compassionate or enlightened. This is the story of an empire in crisis, making desperate calculations to survive mounting legal, financial, and social pressures that threaten its very existence. Part 1. The Collapse of Immutability. The foundation of the Watchtower's authority has always rested on a simple but powerful claim. We speak for God, and therefore we don't make mistakes on essential matters. Yes, they admitted to adjustments in understanding, cleverly rebranded as New Light, based on Proverbs 4 verse 18, but these were presented as progressive revelations, not reversals. The light gets brighter, they insisted, it doesn't flip back and forth like a defective lamp. This narrative served a crucial psychological function. It meant that when the governing body issued a directive, no matter how arbitrary or painful, faithful witnesses could trust it was coming from Jehovah himself. The organization's unity across cultures and continents was presented as miraculous proof of divine backing. No other religion, they claimed, could maintain such doctrinal consistency across millions of believers. This was the evidence that separated them from the confused, divided churches of Babylon the Great. The older publications are filled with this rhetoric. The Watchtower magazines from the 1980s and 1990s regularly contrasted the unchanging standards of God's organization with the compromising nature of other churches. When Protestant denominations began ordaining women or accepting homosexuality, the witnesses pointed to this as proof of apostasy and worldly influence. We, they declared, follow the Bible, not popular opinion. But something shifted dramatically in the 2020s. The confident declarations of unchanging truth began to crack. The organization that once mocked Christendom for going soft on moral standards found itself in an impossible position. Around the world, governments were no longer treating the Watchtower as just another benign religion. Courts in Norway, Spain, Belgium, and Japan were examining the organization's policies on shunning, blood transfusions, and child abuse reporting with increasing scrutiny. The price tag for maintaining biblical standards was climbing into the hundreds of millions in lost subsidies, legal fees, and potential criminal charges. The video updates from 2024 and early 2025 reveal the strain. Watch Jeffrey Jackson or Kenneth Cook deliver these policy changes, and you can see the careful linguistic gymnastics. They never admit they were wrong before. They never apologize for the decades of suffering these policies caused. Instead, they frame every reversal as a clarification or a helpful adjustment that will allow witnesses to have more freedom of conscience. The word mistake never appears. The phrase, we were too strict, is absent. Everything is packaged as evidence of a more mature understanding, as if cruelty was simply an immature phase they've now outgrown. But the members who've been in the organization for 40 or 50 years know better. They remember the harsh discipline, the public humiliation of those who violated these very standards that are now being quietly discarded. They remember young men being denied privileges because they showed up to the Kingdom Hall with a hint of stubble. They remember women being counseled for wearing pantsuits to field service, even in freezing weather. They remember the talks from the platform declaring that these standards were not negotiable, that they reflected Jehovah's view of headship, submission, and proper Christian appearance. Now those same standards are gone, and the governing body expects everyone to accept this without question, without demanding an explanation for why Jehovah's view apparently changed. The psychological damage of this whiplash cannot be overstated. For many faithful witnesses, especially those in their 60s and 70s who dedicated their entire lives to these standards, the message is clear. The suffering you endured, the relationships you lost, the opportunities you sacrificed, they were all for policies the organization itself no longer believes in. This is the true end of immutability. Not because the organization admitted error, but because they erased their own history while pretending nothing fundamental has changed. And once members start to see this pattern, once they recognize that the faithful slave is making reactive, desperate decisions based on external pressure rather than divine guidance, the entire authority structure begins to crumble. Part 2. The beard as a tool of control. To understand how devastating the recent policy changes have been, we need to examine what might seem like the most trivial change: the acceptance of beards. On the surface, this appears to be such a minor issue that spending time analyzing it seems almost absurd. It's facial hair. But in the context of high control groups, nothing is trivial when it comes to regulating personal appearance. The Watchtower's ban on beards for men in positions of responsibility wasn't based on any biblical principle. The Bible actually depicts many faithful servants of God with beards, including Jesus himself in most artistic representations. The policy emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, a time when beards were associated with counterculture movements, hippies, and rebellion against traditional authority. The organization decided that beards conveyed worldliness and could stumble others, particularly in Western countries where clean-shaven faces were the corporate norm. But here's what made this policy so insidious. Its complete arbitrariness made it the perfect loyalty test. Because there was no scriptural basis, following the beard restriction became a pure act of submission to organizational authority. A man who wanted to serve as a ministerial servant or elder had to demonstrate his willingness to subordinate his personal preferences, his comfort, even his cultural norms, to whatever the Watchtower decreed. In countries where beards were culturally normal or even expected, witness men had to distinguish themselves by shaving, marking themselves as different from their communities to prove their dedication. The psychology behind this is well documented in research on authoritarian groups. When leaders require followers to comply with arbitrary, uncomfortable rules, they accomplish several things simultaneously. First, they create visible markers of group membership that separate adherents from outsiders. Second, they establish a clear hierarchy where the leader's word is law, regardless of logic or reason. Third, they identify the most compliant followers, those who will obey even irrational commands, making them ideal candidates for positions of authority who will replicate this obedience downward. For decades, the beard policy worked exactly as designed. Young men who wanted to reach out for privileges learned quickly that personal grooming preferences were not personal at all. The body, in the Watchtower's view, belonged to the organization. How you presented yourself was not about comfort, cultural norms, or individual expression. It was about conformity, submission, and demonstrating that you valued organizational approval above all else. The cruelty of this system revealed itself most clearly in the countless judicial committees and council sessions where beards became the focus. Men who had facial skin conditions making shaving painful were told to endure the discomfort. Men from cultures where beards were signs of maturity and dignity were told their culture was less important than organizational unity. And perhaps most grotesquely, men who wore beards were often associated with apostasy or spiritual weakness, their facial hair becoming visual evidence of rebellion against Jehovah's appointed channel. Now, in 2025, that entire structure collapsed overnight. In a brief video update, the governing body announced that beards were now a matter of personal choice. No explanation for the change. No acknowledgement of the decades of pain this policy caused. No apology to the men who lost privileges, faced humiliation, or were marked as spiritually weak because of their facial hair. Just a casual announcement that the brothers now had freedom in this area, as if freedom was something the governing body was generously granting rather than something they had unjustly withheld for generations. The immediate effect was jarring. Within weeks, kingdom halls around the world saw elders and ministerial servants growing beards, some tentatively, others with obvious relief. The very men who had enforced the ban now embraced the freedom they had denied to others. But for many in the congregations, especially those who had suffered under the policy, The questions were unavoidable. If this was always permissible, why were we punished for it? If this was always a matter of conscience, why was it treated as a test of spirituality? And most damning of all, if the faithful slave was wrong about something this visible and this enforced for this long, what else might they be wrong about? The beard policy, in its rise and fall, encapsulates everything wrong with the Watchtower's claim to divine guidance. It demonstrates how arbitrary rules, backed by organizational authority and enforced through social pressure, can create deep psychological compliance even when those rules have no rational or scriptural foundation. And it reveals how quickly the organization will abandon its own positions when maintaining them becomes costly, all while gaslighting members into believing nothing significant has changed. Part 3. The European Legal Tsunami. To understand why the governing body suddenly became so flexible after decades of rigidity, we need to follow the money and the law. The wave of policy changes that began in 2023 didn't emerge from prayerful meditation or deeper scriptural understanding. They emerged from a series of devastating legal and financial setbacks in Europe, particularly in Norway, that threatened the organization's economic model and forced a rapid recalculation of what principles were truly non-negotiable. The Norwegian crisis became the template that terrified Watchtower leadership. In 2021, the Norwegian government made a decision that sent shockwaves through the organization. They revoked Jehovah's Witnesses' status as a registered religious community, which immediately cut off millions in annual state subsidies. The reason? The government determined that the Watchtower's shunning policy violated the human rights of former members, particularly children who were baptized young and later disfellowshipped, effectively cutting them off from their entire family and social network. Norway wasn't making a theological argument. They were making a civil rights argument. The government position was straightforward. You can believe whatever you want, but if you receive state funding, you cannot enforce policies that violate fundamental human rights, including the right to family relationships and freedom of religion. The Watchtower's practice of requiring members to completely shun disfellowshipped family members, including refusing to eat meals with them or speak to them beyond basic necessities, crossed this line. The Watchtower's initial response was predictable: righteous indignation. They appealed the decision, arguing religious freedom and the right to maintain their biblical standards. They framed the government's action as persecution, proof that Satan was attacking God's organization. The problem was that similar challenges were emerging across Europe. Spain was investigating complaints about shunning and child welfare. Belgium had long-standing concerns about the organization's structure and practices. The European Court of Human Rights was considering cases that could set precedents affecting all of Europe. But Norway represented something unique, a direct financial penalty that was both immediate and massive. The loss of state subsidies meant millions of kroner annually that the organization could no longer count on. More frighteningly, if Norway's legal reasoning spread to other European countries, the Watchtower stood to lose tens or even hundreds of millions in subsidies, tax exemptions, and other financial benefits that religious organizations typically enjoy. The governing body faced a calculation that went to the heart of their operation. On one side was a policy they had maintained for decades, a policy they had claimed was biblically mandated and essential to keeping the congregation clean. On the other side was financial catastrophe in one of their most lucrative regions. European branches had been cash cows for the organization, not only through direct donations but through the respectability and legal protections that came with being recognized as a legitimate religion rather than a cult or harmful organization. Japan added another pressure point. In early 2023, Japanese courts began hearing cases from former witnesses who had been shunned, with some plaintiffs seeking damages for the psychological harm caused by enforced family separation. Unlike the European cases which focused on government subsidies, the Japanese cases opened the possibility of direct civil liability. If Japanese courts ruled that the organization could be held financially responsible for the suffering caused by shunning, it would create a precedent that could spread globally. The potential financial exposure was staggering. The changes that followed tell us exactly how the governing body prioritized these pressures. In late 2023 and throughout 2024, they began walking back the harshest elements of the shunning policy, particularly regarding disfellowshipped family members. The new guidance, delivered through video updates and letters to elders, allowed for necessary family business, and even attendance at Kingdom Hall meetings. Former members could be greeted, though not socially associated with. The language was carefully calibrated to appear like a compassionate adjustment while maintaining enough distance to preserve organizational control. What makes this so revealing is what didn't change. The organization didn't soften its stance on blood transfusions, even though this policy has also faced legal scrutiny and costs lives. They didn't liberalize their position on LGBTQ issues, even though this stance increasingly isolates them in Western countries. They changed the policies that governments were actively penalizing with financial consequences. Everything else remained rigid. This exposes the truth behind the Watchtower's claim to divine guidance. If these policies were truly based on unchanging biblical principles, they shouldn't be negotiable regardless of financial pressure. If shunning was essential to maintaining congregation purity as recently as 2022, it should still be essential in 2025. But when faced with a choice between principle and profit, between doctrine and dollars, the governing body chose the money. And they did it while pretending that nothing fundamental had changed, that this was simply a clarification rather than a capitulation. The bitter irony is impossible to miss. For generations, the Watchtower has taught its members that Babylon the Great, the world empire of false religion, is characterized by its willingness to compromise biblical truth for worldly acceptance and financial gain. Yet here was God's supposed sole channel of truth, adjusting its policies not because of scriptural insight or Holy Spirit guidance, but because secular governments threatened their bank accounts. The very satanic governments they had demonized for decades were now determining their policies more effectively than any claimed divine direction. For thinking witnesses, this sequence of events raised impossible questions. If the organization was truly led by Jehovah's Spirit, why did it take government pressure to recognize that their shunning policy was cruel? Why didn't the faithful slave anticipate these problems and adjust proactively out of compassion? And most troubling of all, if they were willing to change this policy to avoid financial losses, what does that say about every other policy they claim is non-negotiable? Part 4. Rebranding the witness image. While legal pressures forced changes to shunning policies, a different kind of crisis was driving the transformation of the Watchtower's visual identity. The organization was facing a public relations disaster. They looked like a cult from the 1950s, and that image was actively preventing growth, particularly among younger generations who saw the rigid dress codes and appearance standards as bizarre and alienating. The statistics told a damning story. Despite decades of door-to-door work and increasingly sophisticated media campaigns, the Watchtower's growth rate in developed countries had stalled and, in many places, reversed. Young people raised in the organization were leaving at unprecedented rates. The third and fourth generation witnesses, who should have been the organization's most stable demographic, were disappearing. Exit surveys and online testimonies revealed a consistent theme. Many young people felt embarrassed to identify as witnesses because of how strange the organization appeared to outsiders. The dress code had become a particular liability. The requirement for men to wear suits and ties, even in casual field service or at congregation gatherings, marked witnesses as oddly formal and out of touch. In an era when even corporate offices had moved to business casual and tech companies celebrated hoodies and jeans, the Watchtower's insistence on 1950s corporate attire made them look like time travelers or cult members playing dress-up. The tie, that symbol of mid-century conformity that even Wall Street had largely abandoned, became a visual shorthand for the organization's resistance to cultural evolution. For women, the restrictions were even more suffocating. The insistence on dresses or skirts, even in cold weather or during physical activities like construction work at Kingdom Hall builds, was both impractical and increasingly seen as misogynistic. Young women in particular found these rules humiliating, especially when contrasted with the freedom their non-witness peers enjoyed. The modest dress guidelines, which had always been strict, had calcified into an unwritten uniform that communicated submission, passivity, and a worldview that treated female bodies as perpetual sources of temptation requiring constant regulation. The governing body's initial response to declining growth was predictable: blame the members. The problem wasn't the message or the image, they insisted. It was that publishers weren't zealous enough, weren't taking the ministry seriously enough, weren't willing to sacrifice enough. The solution was always more meetings, more field service, more study. The idea that the organization itself might be the problem was unthinkable. But by 2023, even the governing body couldn't ignore reality. The next generation was not just leaving, they were actively embarrassed by their witness upbringing. Social media had made the organization's reputation crisis visible and quantifiable. Videos of witnesses in their formal attire approaching people on the streets circulated as examples of awkward religious encounters. Kingdom Hall meetings and conventions, with their rigid formality and outdated presentation styles, looked increasingly bizarre when clips appeared online. The very visibility the organization had once cultivated through distinctive appearance had become a liability in an age where religious affiliation was increasingly seen as a private matter and overt proselytizing was viewed with suspicion or mockery. The rebranding campaign that followed was calculated and comprehensive. In late 2024, updates began appearing that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. Men were informed that ties were no longer required for teaching assignments or field service. The language was carefully framed to suggest this was about removing unnecessary burdens and allowing brothers to be comfortable and natural in their service. What they didn't say was that they were desperately trying to make witnesses less visually distinct, less immediately identifiable as members of a high-control group. The women's dress code underwent an even more dramatic transformation. In early 2025, the announcement came that women could wear appropriate pants to meetings and in field service. The qualification, appropriate, maintained some organizational control, but the fundamental shift was seismic. For decades, pants on women had been associated with rebellion, worldliness, and feminist ideology. Now, suddenly, they were permissible. The cognitive dissonance was stunning, particularly for older sisters who had endured decades of counsel and judgment for any deviation from skirts and dresses. These changes were not about compassion or progressive theology. They were about market positioning. The Watchtower was attempting to rebrand itself as a mainstream Christian denomination rather than a high-control apocalyptic sect. By softening the most visually distinctive elements of witness culture, they hoped to reduce the cult factor that was driving potential converts and young members away. The goal was to make witnesses look more like their evangelical neighbors, less like a rigid organization with totalitarian control over personal appearance. But rebranding without fundamental change creates its own problems. The organization was trying to look more normal while maintaining the very control structures that made them abnormal. They wanted to appear less cultish while continuing to practice disfellowshipping, refusing blood transfusions, and demanding absolute obedience to the governing body's direction. They wanted the marketing benefits of looking mainstream while preserving the high-control environment that characterized their internal culture. The response from long-time members revealed the psychological damage of these sudden reversals. Many older witnesses, particularly women who had internalized the modesty teachings for decades, struggled with the new freedom. They had spent their entire lives believing that pants were spiritually dangerous, that wearing them would demonstrate rebellion against headship and invite sexual attention. Now they were told to treat it as a non-issue. The whiplash was cognitive and emotional. Some embraced the change with relief. Others felt betrayed, their lifelong sacrifice rendered meaningless by organizational expedients. Younger witnesses had a different reaction: anger. They had been judged, counseled, and sometimes publicly humiliated for wanting to dress like their peers. They had been told that Jehovah cared deeply about their appearance, that modesty and formality were essential to being acceptable to God. They had watched friends and family members face consequences for minor deviations from dress codes that were now being casually discarded. The message was clear: you suffered for nothing. The standards you were told reflected divine will were actually just cultural preferences that the organization would abandon the moment they became inconvenient. The rebranding effort also exposed the organization's fundamental misunderstanding of their crisis. They seemed to believe that if they just looked more normal, people would stop leaving and new converts would arrive. But the problem wasn't primarily visual. The problem was the authoritarianism, the shunning, the apocalyptic fear-mongering, the failed prophecies, the cover-ups of child abuse, and the crushing burden of guilt and obligation that characterized witness life. You could put a witness in jeans and a t-shirt, remove the tie and the formal dress, and they would still be trapped in a high-control group that demanded absolute submission and punished independent thinking. The image change was cosmetic surgery on an organization that needed intensive therapy. Part 5. The Field Service Report Illusion. Few changes revealed the Watchtower's desperation more clearly than the 2023 announcement regarding field service reports. For over a century, the detailed monthly reporting of hours, publications placed, and return visits had been fundamental to witness identity and organizational culture. The report slip was not just administrative paperwork. It was the measure of your worth as a Christian, the evidence of your dedication to Jehovah, and the basis for receiving privileges or facing judgment. Now, almost overnight, this entire system was being dramatically simplified, and the reasons why expose both the organization's statistical crisis and their cynical manipulation of member perception. The field service report had always served multiple functions. Ostensibly, it allowed the organization to track global preaching activity and identify territories that needed more attention. But its real purposes were psychological and controlling. The monthly requirement to report created constant pressure to participate in field service, even when it was ineffective or uncomfortable. The specific tracking of hours meant that members were always quantifying their spiritual worth, always able to be compared to others, always falling short of the pioneering ideal that the organization held up as the standard of true dedication. The system created a brutal hierarchy. Regular publishers might manage 8 or 10 hours per month, always feeling inadequate compared to auxiliary pioneers at 50 hours and regular pioneers at 70. The organization praised those with high numbers while subtly, and sometimes overtly, questioning the spirituality of those who struggled to report even minimal time. For decades, elders and circuit overseers used field service reports as the primary metric for determining who was spiritually strong enough to receive privileges or marry into exemplary families. But by the 2020s, the field service report had become an embarrassment. The numbers told a story the organization desperately didn't want visible. The preaching work was failing spectacularly. The hours to convert ratio had become absurd. In many developed countries, it took thousands or tens of thousands of hours of preaching to produce a single baptism, and even those new baptisms were increasingly just the children of existing members rather than genuine converts from the world. Door-to-door ministry, once the defining characteristic of Jehovah's Witnesses, had become almost comically ineffective. Societal changes had made the practice increasingly difficult and unpleasant. More people lived in gated communities or apartment buildings with locked entrances. Security cameras and doorbell cameras made unexpected visitors feel threatening rather than welcome. The cultural norm had shifted decisively against unsolicited door-knocking, with most householders finding it intrusive and annoying rather than respectful or interesting. The pandemic accelerated this collapse. When in-person preaching stopped during COVID-19, the organization desperately tried to maintain activity through letter writing, phone witnessing, and virtual ministry. They counted time for writing letters that were likely never read, for leaving voicemails that were immediately deleted, for standing near carts that people actively avoided. The numbers held up artificially during this period because the bar for counting time dropped so low, but the complete lack of meaningful results became impossible to hide. Then came the return to door-to-door work in 2022 and 2023, and the disaster became visible. After years away from the doors, many witnesses found they had lost their tolerance for rejection and confrontation. The world had moved on and become even less receptive to religious door-knocking. The few people who answered doors were often irritated, having assumed that this outdated practice had finally died during the pandemic. The preaching work that had once been presented as urgent and effective was revealed as a humiliating exercise that produced almost no tangible results. The statistical evidence was damning. Internal congregation reports showed declining field service participation, even as the organization pressured members to resume in-person preaching. The publishers who were reporting time were often engaging in what could charitably be called creative counting, driving slowly through a territory to drop off a tract, standing near a cart while actually just checking their phone, writing letters they knew wouldn't be read but that allowed them to report hours. The entire system had become a theatrical performance where everyone pretended the work was productive while privately knowing it was pointless. More troubling for the organization, the detailed reporting was making the decline visible and quantifiable. Each congregation, circuit, and branch could see their numbers dropping. The reports that were supposed to motivate members were instead demoralizing them, providing concrete evidence that the urgent life-saving work was having no discernible impact. Publishers could see that they were spending hours each week in an activity that produced no results, and the cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. The 2023 announcement reframed the entire reporting system. The organization announced that they were simplifying the process to make it easier for brothers and sisters to report their activity. Hours would no longer be required for most publishers, only an indication of whether they had participated in some form of ministry during the month. The change was presented as a blessing, a removal of burdensome paperwork that would allow witnesses to focus on the joy of ministry rather than the stress of counting time. But the real effect was to destroy the ability to measure decline. By removing the requirement to report specific hours, the organization made it impossible for members to see how much their collective activity was shrinking. A publisher who went out once for 15 minutes and a publisher who spent 40 hours that month would both be counted the same way. The statistical sleight of hand was obvious to anyone paying attention. When your numbers are going down, stop counting. The timing was particularly telling. The simplification came immediately after the first full year of post-pandemic reporting, a year that had likely shown catastrophic declines in actual field service activity. By changing the metrics before those declines became a pattern, the organization could claim that any future decreases were just artifacts of the new reporting system rather than evidence of genuine collapse in member engagement. For many long-time witnesses, this change triggered a crisis of faith more profound than almost any other recent development. These were people who had structured their entire lives around accumulating field service hours. They had sacrificed careers, education, family time, and personal interests to reach hourly goals that the organization had taught them were essential to Jehovah's approval. They had felt shame and guilt every month when their hours were low, had been denied privileges because their reports weren't impressive enough, had been counseled for not doing more. Now the organization was saying those hours didn't matter after all. The metric that had been used to judge their spirituality for decades was suddenly irrelevant. The sacrifices they had made to be regular pioneers or special pioneers were retroactively rendered meaningless. The organization that had taught them that Jehovah was keeping track of every hour was now saying that actually, counting hours wasn't really important. The message was implicit but unavoidable. Your suffering was pointless. Your dedication was wasted on an organization that will abandon any standard the moment maintaining it becomes inconvenient. The Field Service Report simplification revealed the Watchtower's core strategy for managing decline: make the decline invisible. If members can't see the numbers dropping, they can't have their faith shaken by the evidence of organizational failure. If statistical comparison becomes impossible, publishers can't recognize that their individual ineffectiveness is part of a systemic collapse. The organization was choosing deliberate obscurity over transparency, protecting its authority by preventing members from seeing the truth of their collective failure. The rapid changes between 2023 and 2026 are not evidence of an organization becoming more enlightened or compassionate. They're evidence of an organization in crisis, making reactive, desperate decisions driven by external pressure rather than internal conviction. The governing body that claimed for over a century to speak with divine authority has been forced to bend by secular governments, adjust to avoid bankruptcy, and rebrand to stop hemorrhaging members. Every change has been framed as progressive revelation, but the pattern is clear. They change what they're forced to change, when they're forced to change it, and not a moment sooner. For believing witnesses trying to process these developments, the cognitive dissonance is becoming unbearable. If these policies were wrong all along, why did God's organization enforce them for decades? If these standards weren't actually biblical, why were people disfellowshipped for violating them? If the governing body can be so dramatically wrong about matters they claimed reflected divine will, what else might they be wrong about? The organization is counting on institutional inertia, on the power of sunk costs, on the fear of losing community and family, to keep most members from following these questions to their logical conclusion. And for many, especially older members whose entire lives are invested in the organization, that strategy will work. They'll accept the changes, rationalize the contradictions, and continue to believe that somehow, despite all evidence to the contrary, this is still God's sole channel of truth on earth. But for increasing numbers, especially younger members with access to information and alternative communities online, the illusion is shattering. The Watchtower's desperate transformation is not saving the organization. It's exposing it. Every policy reversal is another crack in the facade, another piece of evidence that this was never about divine direction but always about human control. The empire is crumbling, not because of satanic persecution as they'll claim, but because it was built on a foundation of false prophecy, manipulative control, and willingness to sacrifice members' well-being for institutional preservation. The next decade will determine whether the Watchtower can complete its transformation into a mainstream Christian denomination, abandoning the high-control aspects that defined it while maintaining enough distinctiveness to survive, or whether the accumulated weight of failed prophecies, exposed lies, and lost trust will trigger terminal decline. Either way, the organization that emerges from this crisis, if one emerges at all, will be fundamentally different from the one that entered it. And the members who remain will carry the scars of watching everything they were told was unchangeable and divinely mandated get negotiated away to protect an institution that was willing to sacrifice them for its own survival.